hell is he? If you've never heard of James Madison, that's because he is what's known as a forgotten president. Pretty much anyone can name 6 or 7 presidents, but there's about 20 that you have never heard of. In fact, he left such a small impression on the presidency that I feel like cheating just talking about him, and I'll talk about the following president as well. He was the first president to wear trousers. All the other presidents wore breeches. This is the most interesting fact about this guy. He was known as the father of the Constitution. He was also known as the father of the Bill of Rights. His second cousin was Zachary Taylor, who became the 12th president of America. He is also a forgotten president. He suffered frostbite of the nose. He was 5'4" and only weighed 100 pounds, making him the smallest American president ever. His friends called him Little Jemmy. The Star-Spangled Banner anthem was written during his presidency. I actually counted. It took me 39 attempts to say Star-Spangled Banner anthem. I was like Star-Spangled Banther anthem. Yeah, it's like a tongue twister. He famously said, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary." In my notes, I said, "If men were angles." That's bad. Oh no, that's the version I published in my book. I gotta fix that. I wrote a book about American presidents, so if you buy a copy and it says angles, I'm sorry, the typo went out, so apologies. The White House burned down during his presidency. Oh, he can't do anything right. He is the only president to have 2 vice presidents that died while serving office. His final words were, "I always talk better lying down." His cause of death is unknown. Like, how boring is this guy? How'd he die? Don't know. How boring do you have to be to make you dying not interesting enough to remember? Alright, that's it. Let's move on to the next guy. Although this guy is also considered to be a forgotten president, he was extremely influential during his 8 years as president. When James Monroe was elected, he took 15 weeks off to visit cities throughout the country. These visits were considered a goodwill tour, and newspapers started declaring that Americans were living in the era of good feelings. This was the first time since the presidency began where America was no longer involved in wars. The American people assumed they wouldn't be in another war again. How very, very wrong they were. Monroe had a habit of just showing up randomly at historic moments and rubbing shoulders with many major figures. He's like a historical Forrest Gump. He served Lord Sterling. He took care of the Marquis de Lafayette after he was wounded in the Battle of Brandywine Creek. When George Washington was a general, the two crossed Delaware together through Valley Forge. Monroe and his friends broke into the mansion of the corrupt Governor Dunmore and stole 200 muskets, 300 swords, and 18 pistols. He gave all the weapons to the local militia to help with the revolution. He was only 17 at the time. He got shot by a musket ball in the shoulder, which severed an artery, nearly killing him. His friend tied it off, saving his life. It took him 2 months to recuperate. He famously said, "The best form of government is that which is most likely to prevent the greatest sum of evil." Monroe investigated the first political sex scandal since the beginning of the American presidency. He played a key role investigating the sex scandal of the first Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton. Monroe had a reputation to never back down from a fight. Even when he was in his 60s, Senator and Minister William Crawford threatened Monroe in the White House after the president fired several of Crawford's friends. Crawford roared at Monroe and said, "I wish you would not dilly-dally." It was probably intimidating at the time. Even though Crawford was over a decade younger than Monroe, the president wasn't remotely intimidated. Instead, he got up from his chair, picked up burning tongs from his fireplace, and stared out Crawford until he left. He's only the second person who served as Secretary of War and Secretary of State simultaneously. This was during the War of 1812. In 1814, the British burned down the White House, the Capitol, the Library of Congress, and the Supreme Court. Monroe took the oath of office in 1816, where the White House was so heavily burnt that it didn't even have furniture. The original builder of the White House, James Hoban, had to rebuild it. Monroe used so much of his own money to refurbish the White House that he found himself in heavy debt for most of his life. When the White House was rebuilt, it was the first time that it was painted white. Okay, here's a few quick ones. 2 years after Monroe's presidency, America entered its first economic depression. It lasted 3 years. He was the first president to ride in a steamboat. He was the last founding father to become president. His nickname was the last cocked hat. He ran unopposed during his re-election, and he was heavily criticized for wearing clothes that were decades out of date. Monroe called slavery an evil institution. Nevertheless, 40 slaves worked on his 600-acre tobacco farm. He gave his slaves more freedom than most, but he still believed that white people were superior, which kind of defeats the concept of slavery being bad. Bit of a double standard, Monroe. Monroe dreamed of forming an African state populated entirely by freed slaves. Liberia is an African country that is colonized by freed African Americans. The capital, Monrovia, is named after Monroe. I'll be talking about Liberia more in an upcoming countries video, so watch out for that if you want to know more about that country. Many slave owners chose slaves based on their abilities, but Monroe did everything in his power to keep his slaves' families together. Since Monroe's legacy revolved around slavery, it's not too hard to believe that he himself was nearly kidnapped by an army of white, African, and Haitian slaves in 1800. Hours before the kidnapping was meant to occur, some of the slaves chickened out and ran to inform Monroe of the plan. The slaves were caught, nearly 30 of them were hanged at the gallows. After his presidency, Monroe had to sell his plantation in 1830 and moved in with his daughter as he was practically penniless. Monroe died of tuberculosis. He died on July the 4th, just like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. His final words were, "I regret that I should leave this world without again holding him." He was talking about his best friend, James Madison, the previous president. Hey guys, just to let you know that obviously when I'm done all of these presidents, I'll move on to another subject. If you check out my Amazon account under my name, James Egan, you will see all the books I've written. I've written books about pretty much everything: space, animals, actors, movies, comic books, whatever. And see whatever one tickles your fancy, and if I get enough demand about it, I'll start doing facts about that one. So check it out, and I'll see you tomorrow.